Okay, thank you. Let's continue. So for our second lecture of the seminar, our guest is Jan Rettig from Bremen. He is working currently on his PhD at the University of Bremen on the subject matter of the transnational cooperation of extreme right parties in Europe. And as you can see from the lecture title, and thematic aspect of what he's working on his PhD he will cover today. The title of the lecture you have projected onto the wall, so I don't need to read it. And I won't continue any further, so please, Jan.
Thanks very much for the invitation too. I was a little bit flattered to get invited by you guys here. And since, in difference to Joachim, I'm here the first time, maybe some more words on my person, because I was a little embarrassed to read in the introduction to the seminar that I figure obviously as a relevant international scholar. I'm sure I'm not. But yeah, I'm writing or I'm working on this PhD thesis on transnational corporations. I can do so by the support of the Hans Böckler Foundation, which is a trade union foundation in Germany. And apart from that, I'm more on the activist side of anti-fascism and anti-racist initiatives. I called the presentation Nation Trumps Economy, Performance, Interaction and Impact of Two Discourse Communities of Parties Across Europe. What I want to present you, or what I want to tell you, first, I was invited on the basis of an article I wrote about economic policies of exemplary far-right parties across Europe. So this will be the first point to say something about this. There are probably some overlappings with what Joachim already told us in the morning, so I try to shorten it spontaneously, not to bore you too much. I will then talk about some theory and some empirical findings on the discourse community I called uneasily Identitarian-Essentialist nationalism. Then go further to far-right parties and their transnational cooperations. Oh, that's missing here. And maybe put some thesis for a further discussion. So the parties in question originally were the UK Independence Party, the Alternative for Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, the Front National, and the FPÖ. My criteria for analysis then were three. It was an overall ideological fundament, which I leave out in the beginning because I come back to this in the respective part later. Economic policies in a more narrow sense, meaning general and concrete positions on propositions, for example, like for the state budget, the currency policy, trade relations and stuff. And the third category was social policies, as far as economic questions were touched more or less directly. We all do know that social policies are in a sense economically or materially touching the same questions, but I didn't want to go too far. So starting with the UK Independence Party, a very straight neoliberal example from the beginning on, founded in 1993. It hasn't changed much up to today. Their founding reason explicitly was to leave the to leave the European Union, an objective they almost reached, maybe 1 or 2 years missing. But yes, their economic and social policies were straight neoliberal. They demanded for reductions of public expenditures, deficits and debts. They wanted to privatize and deregulate all economic sectors. They asked for for massive cuts in social care and welfare, up to its privatization even. and especially for deregulation of labor conditions. They did, however, add some non-neoliberal additions. I wouldn't call them protectionist, but because the thesis is that they added them for the so-called left behinds, a growing community of unemployed and left behind people in Britain as well, like, for example, a tax relief for the lowest incomes or the implementation of a minimum wage. The next example, the Alternative for Germany, Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, is the youngster of these parties. It's a little bit different. The economic policies, as Joachim already pointed out, are more or less straight neoliberal as well. Their founding reason was to leave the Eurozone. One can say superficially, or tactically, but they agitated, at least at the beginning, very much with this topic. They as well asked for a politics of currency stability, for rigid austerity to confront the European debt crisis, and for the reduction of bureaucracy and regulation in favor of economic competitiveness. Their social policies, on the other hand, were kind of a mixture, I would say. They had strong neoliberal parts as well. They wanted to introduce an even harder workfare regime. They call it activating basic security, which more or less is a chiffre, to get the people to work. They demanded upper limit for taxes and the abolition of property and inheritance taxes. But they had protectionist measures as well, like the preservation of the minimum wage, which you already have in Germany. They propagated the conservative support for family as a value. In my eyes, that implies the social reprivatization of care work. But they asked too for example, plebiscitary decisions on privatizations, especially in the sectors of housing and care as well. But in an overall perspective, I would say they did not, or they do not have until today, a real social program, or as we called it in Germany, they do not answer the social question. The most interesting case of these parties, or of the selection of parties, I'd say, in politico-economic terms, is the Front National, because the Front National experienced a major change in its history. He started off in the 70s as an ultra-liberal, neoliberal party. They asked for the reduction, for a massive reduction of the public expenditure quota. They wanted to privatize all nationalized businesses, up to even some ministries. And what nobody nowadays can imagine anymore, they endorsed even a further European integration. Right? They were asking for a single European market, for a common currency, a common police, and a unified European law system. Yeah, this was in the 70s and at the beginning of the 80s. And they had the respective social policy program, as I already pointed out, as the other parties had. Then at the beginning of the 90s, more or less in the context of the GATT agreement, which then was a global trade agreement for free trade, there was a change starting when they started a campaign for a so-called nouvelle protectionisme, a new protectionism, and they had a phase of around like 10 years or so where they had contradictory demands in their programs. There were neoliberal demands side by side with social protectionist demands. But to nowadays, they totally inversed all their neoliberal positions into the opposite. So that we can now talk of that I would evaluate this turn as an etatist, protectionist, anti-neoliberal, and anti-European turn, which is valid until today. And the last party, which is the grandpa of the selection, is the Freiheitliche Partei Österreich, the Libertarian Party of Austria. I say grandpa because this is one of the parties still having, or for its foundation history, it has the tightest links to historical fascism of all these parties. But in economic terms, they didn't care much until the 80s to economic policy. When they, in the mid-80s, they developed a radical neoliberal economic program, which pretty much looked like this, what I told about the Front National. Maybe not so detailed in the pro-European programmatics, but they were pro-European too. And like the Front National, the FPÖ changed this position towards the European Union drastically at the beginning of the 90s as well. But in difference to the Front National, they maintained their neoliberal policies. Although, Joachim pointed this out already, there is a superficial critique, for example, on international free trade, which I interpreted more as an anti-American, anti-European motivated critique, which is ideologically not very convincing. So my main conclusions of this of the analysis then were that sorry, I have to you probably know this logo. This is the Serb Radical Party. I tried to pull that in, but since I don't speak Serbian or Serbo-Croat, I just pulled them in the nationalism part, so but they appeared already here. All of these parties have a stable neoliberal fundament, which is interesting because it's, for a long time, amongst scholars at least, it has been seen as a paradox to have the extreme right being neoliberal, because neoliberalism was interpreted more as a plural and open ideology. But as we know now, of course it offers abundant links to classic far-right ideology, starting with the selection of the stronger, the faster, the more powerful ones, or its culturally determined racism, its ethic of achievements, or its hostility against trade unions and democracy, for example. As well, there's a strong neoliberal programmatic amongst all these parties, which can be complemented at times with protectionist measures or demands, but then almost exclusively in the social policy field, not so much in the economic policy field as I defined it earlier. And who's shearing out, as I pointed out already, is the Front National, which seems to have undergone, at least at my point of, from my point of view, a real ideological and programmatic change away from neoliberalism. So, to answer my original question, if this is a suitable pluralism or just a bunch of cumulated inconsistencies, I would say now this broad range does seem suitable, and we can see this, for example, in a Front National's ideology and programmatic, which in itself for at least a decade and still is most inconsistent between neoliberal and protectionist measures. But we can see this as well in cooperation projects, for example, between the FPÖ and the Front National, which are actually standing on different poles of this range. And we can see this, as Joachim already said as well, in heterodox economics working already in praxis. Best example being the Fidesz government. So I came more or less to the conclusion that either economics do not matter for the far right, or they're more of a programmatic than an ideological nature, meaning that those parties can accept that the economics do depend on functional needs, on opportunity structures, on public opinion, and so on, and can be changed more or less, not arbitrarily, but from time to time, how it is needed. But the most important thing I found was that economy never comes alone, at least in the party's programs and statements which are not solely dedicated to economic. It always comes in entanglements, in discursive entanglements with other extreme right or for the extreme right constitutive discourses, like, for example, xenophobia, chauvinism, welfare chauvinism, law and order, and who would have thought it, nationalism. The last one being, in my point of view, the most consistent entanglement I found, up to that in many cases there was a downright subordination of the economy under the national question, though I've never interpreted it as a primacy, as a downright primacy of the political over the economy. I think this is something the far right, or at least the relevant parts of the far right, does have overcome. So if this is true, that nation trumps economy, at least discursively, I thought, well, then I have to watch, or I have to look closer at the respective discourse. What I do in my PhD thesis, for example, is that I try to parallel ideological developments or ideological and programmatic developments with practical developments, meaning with practical cooperations. I had to integrate, looking at the nationalist discourses, very different discourses of these extreme right parties. And what I didn't want to do is now to model a new theory of nationalism or a proper discourse of nationalism, but constructing a so-called discourse community for analytic purposes. Yeah? And the term discourse community derives from a tradition of critical discourse analysis and is characterized by the acceptance and adherence of relatively homogeneous systems of propositions, that is, doctrines, ideologies, discourse, positions, or so-called truth. For this purpose here, acceptance and adherence means more the use and subsumption into that system of propositions on a discursive level rather than on the level of real acting in the real world. So why did I choose the uneasy term of Identitarian-Essentialist nationalism? There are three determinations in there. Nationalism, obviously, talking of the extreme right, we have to talk about nation and nationalism. Doing so, I thought it might be interesting to outline shortly what I understand under nation, so we have common ground, because I think there are lots of different interpretations what nation and nationalism is. And it's just short, I would say with Eric Hobsbawm, that a nation is a construction based on collective myth and on invented traditions, He outlined this already in the 90s. Some 100 years ago or earlier, Henri Renan already outlined this as a collective forgetting, and a collective oblivion on which the nation is based, meaning oblivion of former forms of community, as well as the brutal nation-building processes itself. I found this a very interesting thought. And of course, the nation has the ideological function of justifying an inclusion and an exclusion. Then, by saying that it's a construction, of course, I'm not denying that nations or nationalism do have a material impact. They do exist. They do exist in this world. Otherwise, we wouldn't spend so much time thinking on this. So they have a material function of inclusion and exclusion, of course. I did not want to deny this. Some orthodox Marxists still are talking of the function of covering up of class relations. I'm not quite sure, after the experiences of nationalism from the bottom, if this is quite viable as part of a definition. But surely it's there's some truth in this too, of course. I think by accepting this radical deconstruction of any ontological existence of nation, which I think is important, we got two things clear. This is first the order of appearance of nation and nationalism, which Annie Gellner in the 1960s put that way, that it's not the aspirations of nations which create nationalism, other way around, it's nationalism which creates nations. And in accepting this, we can have an analytical focus now on the ideological justification scheme, which is then nationalism. And I would put this in the words of Benedict Anderson, that communities are to be distinguished not by their falsity or genuineness, because there ain't no falsity or genuineness if they don't exist ontologically, but by the style in which they are imagined. And talking of the style, we arrive at the second determination of my term of the discourse community, which is identity or the identitarian appearances, which at the first glance appears as a tautology, because every nationalism is identitarian. There ain't no non-identitarian nationalism. And there are such different justifications and appearances and respectively different academic concepts of nationalism, like an etatist-oriented, a republican, a civic, a culturalist, a folkish, an ethnicist, a biologistic. I probably have forgotten some. The problems of their usage, I found, is that scholars and observers and experts and who else use them depending on their context and depending on their personal preferences, and they use them interchangeably and therefore variably. So I cannot tell if when one scholar uses culturalist, it's not the same what another is meaning by folkish. And of course, the separating lines between these appearances or justifications are fuzzy anyways. No? The one term being a more abstract one, the other one being more concrete. So my question then was, what unifies them all? And I came to the conclusion that it's more or less the relevance itself of identity or identitarian appearances, yeah? Which is, it's this relevance, regardless the content, that matters and differentiates extreme right discourse about nationalism from conservative right or any other nationalist discourse. And this demarcates also something what I called economic nationalism, which is not quite congruent to that was Joachim meant with economic nationalism. What I mean is we have a word in Germany, or a fixed term, it's called Standort nationalism. I didn't find a translation, a good translation in English, because Standort just means location, but it's a fixed term for an economic location in Germany. So I could otherwise say just mainstream nationalism, which is characterized nowadays almost exclusively by a certain economism, a certain economic focus. Last thing about the identitarian aspect, another advantage of this term then, or of this aggregation of nationalist appearances, is that I can grasp regionalism as well. There are lots of scholars trying to separate regionalism from nationalism, like, for example, the regionalism of the Liga Nord of the 80s and 90s, because they weren't orientating on an own nation, but I do not have, like, I think what they meant, they weren't orientating on the central state that was existing, but they wanted to make their own administrative structure. We could call this nation as well, I think. And the last determination is the essentialism. This has two meanings, of course. The first one, that the nationalism of the extreme right is essential in itself, yeah, meaning in their discourse. Just shortly, one can say, without nation or nationalism, there is nothing. Yeah? This is kind of a nihilism. And it's essential for the extreme right discourse in general. And this is proven by frequent explicit nationalistic propositions we can find, of course. This we can prove by multiple entanglements with other discourse strands of the party's repertoires. And maybe the most important, we can prove this by an excessive appliance of discourse strategies in which nation or nationalism is always the ultimate justification, the ultimate value, or the ultimate purpose, and never just instrument for anything else. This as well makes a demarcation again to economic nationalism, because it turns around like the relationship of purpose and instrument. And not to forget all these scholars who try to define the nationalist discourse of extreme right parties. I think with this essentialism, in the end, I mean this, what other scholars called radical, ultra, or overreaching nationalism. Terms I have a critique on, but this is something different then. So, now to my empirical findings. The UKIP party, their argumentations, their reasoning is predominantly economically determined. They have a classic welfare chauvinist narrative of Great Britain paying for others, for all the others, while not getting back enough. This is just like the underlying argumentation for everything. But they too have kind of an essentialist contrasting of the European Union versus their national sovereignty, or they always call it independence. This too hasn't changed over time. It was maybe a little bit relativized by the extension of more social-cultural topics like education, the national culture, or immigration. Yeah, and concerning the immigration theme, which got bigger and bigger over the last years for the UKIP, I came about this quote at the end of the 2015. It's the years are the publication years of the respective programs. I think in '97 it was a national parliamentary election, and in 2015 too. I came about this quote, immigration is not about race, it is about space. And like me as a critical German, I was like gasping, what are they telling us here about space? And I hoped that it was just a result of kind of an unconscious populism, yeah, making the rhyme with race and space. But no, it was embedded in a context of a British society, culture and administration which simply cannot bear the sheer number of immigrants following the UKIP. And this way, of course, it was a hint to kind of an exclusive territory, which is integral part of a folkish nationalism, yeah? Of a congruency of a people, a land, and a nation. So I would say in an overall conception, the UKIP still has a very civic conception of nation and nationalism, with a strong draft to economic argumentations, but there surely are glimpses of culturalism. Or, as I just said, a folkish nationalism. For example, when they are talking already in '97 about the political wisdom of the British people, yeah, then this is another hint to a folkish nationalism, because they're not only stating that there is a British people, of course, this is nothing special, but they are giving this people kind of a attribute of a human being, having a political wisdom, being an actor who could act on the basis of its wisdom. Coming to my party, from my land. A widely shared interpretation of the AfD at the beginning was that it's, above all, a strong economic etatist nationalism. I think from the beginning on it had very different currents in it. There was, of course, this national neoliberal wing around the first leaders, Bernd Lucke, Hans-Olaf Henkel. Hans-Olaf Henkel, for example, once was the chairman of the German Alliance of the Industry. And they laid their emphasis on a welfare chauvinism in the frame of international competition. So tended more towards what I earlier called Standort nationalism. And maybe the accumulation is this sentence or this phrase from the first program ever of the AfD, Germany does not need the euro. This is already the second sentence in the program, telling us a lot about their view, their nationalist view. But from the beginning on too, there was a new right, or so-called ethno-pluralist nationalist wing, with close relationships to new right media and culture circles. And a good example is the quote I put here in 2015, when Björn Höcke, which is the chairman or one of the co-chairmen of the AfD in Thuringia, and the chairman of the respective parliamentary faction, when he talked of spoke of the preservation of ethnocultural diversity. This is a classic new right argumentation. But my thesis is that this wing at the end combines with another wing called the folkish ethnicist, sometimes even biologist, racist wing, because this same Höcke later was talking about the so-called life-affirming African expansion type, which has, I didn't put this there, sorry, which definitely has racist and biologist aspects. Another example for this folkish wing is Frauke Petri, who argued in favor of a positive image of the term folkish. Frauke Petri nowadays is assumed to be one of the moderates. Yeah? She just recently left after the last national elections in September, and always was attributed to the Realpolitik wing, the real politics wing, yeah, those who wanted to moderate in order to make them fit for governmental coalitions. She herself talked of a positive image of folkish nationalism, or yeah, of the term folkish. One of the most interesting slogans I found of the AfD is this one here from 2014. That's why I put the poster in there. It's saying, we are not the world's social service department, the central slogan. And this is a good example, I think, for disentanglement I was talking about, because it entangles such different discourses as economy, welfare, immigration, Europe, and nationalism, because at the same time it refers to the European debt crisis and for the payments Germany had to do towards Greece, for example, as well as to the immigration issue, about the immigrants, about the migrants all coming to Germany, and we have to feed them. And this all under the umbrella of a negative connotation of a social service department. Yeah, the Sozialamt in Germany is a term you couldn't find a more negatively connotated term in the social field. Yeah. And funny thing or fun fact about this poster or about this slogan, that the slogan was already used by the National Democratic Party of Germany, a classic Nazi party, already founded in the 1960s from old NSDAP functionaries. It was then used by the Pro-NRW, which is a more regional anti-Muslim party, and it was already used by Horst Seehofer. Horst Seehofer is the current Bavarian Prime Minister and chairman of the Christian Social Union, which is one of those sister parties of CDU, CSU. I think they're already in power now on the federal level for 12 years in a row. He used this slogan as well. So this is pretty good to show the discursive floating of such a slogan between the conservative and the far right. Today, up to today, the AfD experienced several controversies which led to split-offs. Won't tell you more about this. And I would say that what's left nowadays is a predominant ethno-pluralist, folkish nationalism with a strong neoliberal programmatic, especially in the economic policies. And what I wanted to point out, because I don't know if you heard this here, but this AfD was just recently voted into the national parliament with a result of 13%, meaning that they have around 100 deputies now in the parliament, and they are trying to, of course, they are trying to sell themselves as moderate right wings, yeah. But they have a co-chairman called Alexander Gauland. We already heard about him, who directly after the election on the same evening was giving an interview and saying, "We will hunt them," meaning the government. "We will retrieve our country and our people. We will change this country." And I was like shivering. I hadn't researched this yet, but this sounds like an S talk, yeah? And wouldn't wonder if there weren't examples to be found in history when this was used already. At least there is this fascist momentum of changing the country, getting into the movement, and forming another or a new people. And this is the chairman of the AfD. Okay, the Front National. The Front National was a more or less a very broad alliance of different currents of the right and extreme right at its time of founding, which already was in 72, I think, 72 or 73. There were national revolutionaries in it. There were parliamentary nationalists around Le Pen. There were intellectuals, monarchists, and extreme right splinter parties and movements. And as such, I would argue it was kind of a parliamentary offspring, or an early parliamentary offspring of the ideas of the Nouvelle Droite, the New Right, even though they didn't orientate on parliaments. But from the beginning on, as we already heard, they pursued the concept of préférence nationale, which some scholars have interpreted as a primacy of the political over the economy. I would not say, I'd say that this préférence nationale, which actually is now mitigated into a priorité nationale, so they softened their tone from preference to priority. But I would say it's more of a glue to get these currents, to hold these currents together, or as a glue to overcome the changes the FN already experienced, I was talking earlier about. In an overall perspective, I'd say that the Front National pursues a strong republican and civic nationalism, which of course has some culturalist and ethnicist aspects in it. Talking about immigration, for example, there are ethnicist currents in the Front National, or about the integration issue as well. For example, Le Pen, some years ago, only some years ago, still made statements which are more or less pointing into towards a mythological nationalism, yeah, based on blood, soil, and traditions, and this still lives on. Oh, I didn't translate these quotations. Yeah, what I wanted to point out with these quotations the most is the emphasis on the immigration issue. The first and second, for example, is there is one. For once, there is a connection between the women's rights, yeah, défendre les droits des femmes, lutter contre l'islamisme, defend the rights of the women, fight against Islamism, which wants to roll back their fundamental liberties. Actually, the Front National isn't like the fighter of women's rights, but against Islamism, the Front National is. The second, they try to, or they demand to make impossible the regularization or the naturalization of foreigners who came in illegal, and to simplify their and make automatic their expulsion from the country. And they want to, this is the third one, they want to reduce the legal immigration per year to an amount of 10,000 people, which is almost nothing. Yeah, and the last one just being supprimer le droit du sol is take back the right of the soil, meaning France still has a law that if you're born there, you're automatically French. So, and they want to change this because they say being French is an honor. Somewhere else in the program. It says in 2012, être français est un honneur. Okay, almost last one. The FPÖ. Didn't translate that either. Sorry. Yeah, as I pointed out, this is the party with the closest or the tightest links to historical fascism. Fascism in Austria is kind of a specific issue because there were two different currents fighting each other. This is the Austro-fascist current, which didn't win, and the Deutsch National, the German nationalist current, which, well, won until 45, but still lived on ideologically, and they're still asking for more or less an annexation to Germany. The main point of this Deutsche nationalism is that they deny a unique Austrian nation. But they're saying then, on the other hand, well, we are Germans, and we are Germans culturally, ethnically, and in folkish terms. This current was slightly relativized when in the mid-80s the FPÖ turned more or less neoliberal, and when in the 90s the FPÖ made a turn towards an anti-European stance, there really was something, I would interpret it as a more, or as a try to develop a more Austrian-centered nationalism. And they were arguing more with a unique Austrian nation or nationalism. But still, until today, this Deutsche nationalist current exists and has an impact. Nonetheless, in an overall perspective, the nationalism of the FPÖ is a strong folkish culturalist one. Here these quotes say, the single human being is always part of a community, which itself, the community, has rights of liberty, or liberty rights, from the family to the folk. Yeah? So this is the subordination of the individual to the community, under the community. Then they are talking of that we are living in times of identity deconstruction, not deconstruction, what is Vernichtung? Destruction. Of identity destruction and the alienation of the people from their roots. Yeah? And they're saying that the preservation of our identity is the theme of conscience of our epoch. Yeah, and to make clear their stance towards immigration in the current program to the national elections, which just took place, chapter 1 already is the immigration chapter and starts with Austria is no immigration country. Yeah, then sorry, I took in the Srpska radikalna stranka. Is it there? Okay. Sorry, ignored me. The Serbian Radical Party, the SRS, the reasons to choose them is actually, yeah, it's pretty pragmatically for me, because I was until now personally not engaged in the Southeast European context. And for language reasons, I was totally dependent on secondary literature in English. And admittedly, there ain't so much literature on this. But what I found is that the Radical Party is one of the most successful extreme right parties of this in this ex-Yugoslav context. It was represented in national parliament since '92, except the last legislative period. At times it was even the strongest force without being in government, and it even was in government for a short period. And interesting for me, although small, it does already have some transnational connections since the 90s. To make it short, it's a radical, folkish, ethnicist nationalism they pursue, asking for a great Serbia, meaning a unified ethnical, political, cultural, and economic Serbia, which today would mean a reunification, of course. And they are making the main enemy construction towards ethnic non-Serbs, especially directed against Croatians and Muslims. Interesting about them, because it separates them, or it makes them unique in the selection of parties. They do have a militant praxis, because they already were involved in organizing paramilitary structures in the separation wars. which at least shows that they're not only talking, but ideologically so much convinced to get in practice, if possible. So I would not allow myself a real evaluation, except this, that I had the impression, or have the impression, that it's exactly this radicalism or this militancy of this ethnicist nationalism which might be an explanation for the success for this party, because, as I understood the Serbian societal and political context, the whole political spectrum is already characterized by a very radical nationalism, by discourses I only experiences as extreme right discourses in Western Europe, like the denial of homosexuality, abortion, gender mainstreaming, the existence of abundant conspiracy theories, and the anti-globalization and anti-establishment sentiments. So I don't know. I found an explanation, or I found an evaluation of Vera Stojarova from the Masaryk University in Czech Republic, who was comparing the Croatian, Serbian, and Bosnian-Herzegovinian context, and she was resuming that in Croatia there seems to be, or here in Croatia, there seems to be a far-reaching social consensus about the general direction of development. There is more or less a consensus between the big parties in power about the European integration, and the result is that the extreme right, at least on a party level, remains relatively marginal. While in Serbia it's the other way around. There's a political and social polarization between a pro-European modernism and a tradition-based nationalism, plus only few consensus about other core themes. So the result is there is space for an extreme right at the party level as well. So now this is a very superficial visualization, but I tried to just to locate the parties shortly in this in the context of this discourse community I was constructing. Yeah, I just put these different identitarian appearances, I just put them into this bubble. It's not so clean or neatly separated and organized, but if I should locate the parties in there, we would have the FPÖ, the AfD, and the Front National relatively at the center, somewhere between the folkish, the Republican, the etatist, and the culturalist appearance of nationalism. We would put the UKIP party on the edge, more towards an economic nationalism, almost leaving this discourse community, and the Serb radical party somewhere between this biologistic ethnicist appearance. Since my thesis then, the motivation of my search is to find the what's the point about the cooperation of these extreme right parties. I just want to give you a short insight into transnational cooperation projects, and then we're done. These are all transnational or European transnational party projects, except the what's called VE-ITS. This is ITS was a faction of the European Parliament in 2007, and the VE meaning the Vienna Declaration, which were pretty much the same parties. And not a party was the Euronat project, because in '97 there wasn't an official party status in the European context yet. There haven't been such an official. It's only in 2003 and 2004 been elaborated. yeah, this the axis rightness, don't interpret this too much. I just try to make an overall classification, and I don't have a better term until now. Maybe we could say this with Bobbio, it's not rightness, it's inequality. Yeah. So the farther we get down, the more unequal the ideology is of the parties. Or we can say the farther down, the farther right. Interesting are here only for us these three on the left side, the Movement for the Europe of Nations and Freedom in the middle, the Alliance for Peace and Freedom down there, and the Alliance for Direct Democracy in Europe up there. The Movement for Europe of Nations and Freedom is actually a party project or a cooperation project forced massively by the Front National, and its ideology is pretty good summarized in this one, in the first quotation, where they, not only there but in other contexts too, have a generally a synonymous use of people, nations and states, which I don't interpret as a congruency, but as a try to encompass or to embrace a broad range of different nationalist appearances, from folkish ethnicist to civic republican nationalism, and is therefore kind of a paradigm for me for the discourse community of Identitarian-Essentialist nationalism. And it is reflected by the members pretty well. Part of the MENF is the Vlaams Belang and the FPÖ with very folkish nationalisms, the Liga Nord with a regionalist nationalism, the Czech Svoboda a prima demokracie, SPD, not to mix with the German SPD, which is more of a national conservative party, and the AfD and the Front National, of course. The Alliance for Peace and Freedom is the newest Euro party on the scene. It got only registered the beginning of last year, and there's a relative undisputed folkish ethnicist nationalism amongst their members. Their members are the Italian Forza Nuova, a third-way party, the Crisi Afghi, Golden Dawn, the Greek Golden Dawn, the National Democratic Party of Germany, already mentioned, Democracia Nacional from Spain, pretty much pretty close to all this what we call fascist. They have a relative organicist view on nation, calling it an extended family. The government is the father. They've, above all, the fear of a destruction of our traditional values and consequently of peoples and cultures. This is what in Germany is called the Volkstod by Nazis, or this is what the identitarian movement nowadays calls, more or less, the big exchange. Der große Austausch, another chiffre for the destruction of the peoples. And their fascist one of the fascist momentums they have here, or they display here, is when they call, for example, for a new spirit of honesty and self-sacrifice. Yeah? So a total subordination to the community. But even that current speaks of our common Christian values and European cultural heritage, which is interesting because it does construct kind of a European identity with which they try to argue as well. And I would say that the Serb Radical Party fits in perfectly in this nationalist folkish ethnicist nationalism. So, last party on the European level, the Alliance for Freedom and Direct Democracy doesn't exist anymore. It was closed down for corruption reasons in, I don't know, in May. This was the project of the UKIP party, more or less, and respectively had almost solely anti-European arguments. They demanded here a democratic Europe of nation states instead of the European Union's supremacy on the member states, or they wanted a Europe of nations free and independent in their political choices. What they did not do, in difference to all the other parties, is to fill this nation abstractly with some unique traditions or values or something like this. They never used the term people, nor were they constructing a common European identity, which I interpret as signs that they are very distant already from the discourse community of Identitarian-Essentialist nationalism. So, the last sheet, just to match the original national parties. They were like located here, and I would locate these parties around here. And it does, of course, I'm constructing this, so it must be right. But it more or less fits. Yeah? The Serb Radical Party has an observer status at the Alliance for Peace and Freedom, fitting on this discourse branch. The movement of Europe for the movement for a Europe of nations and freedom, more or less at the center, encompassing all the mentioned parties, and the Alliance for Direct Democracy in Europe. One funny fact about this is that the AfD is involved there too. They were involved in the MENF as well as in the other, explicitly saying they wanted to unite the rightist bloc on the European level. So, yes, no thesis. Sorry, I have loads of theses still, but I wasn't clear before I came here in which direction this seminar goes. Is it more like an academic discussion on what makes sense, which term makes more sense than the other, or is it more an activist orientation? So I wasn't sure which thesis to put in there, but maybe we leave it just like this, and I can just put them into the discussion. So yeah, that's it.
We have a little bit of time for maybe 2 questions and short answers, and then we have a short break of 15 minutes for those who smoke or want to have, grab a coffee, and then we will have the general discussion session where we can, if you have any questions to Jan specifically that now we will not have time to address, then of course it's also a legitimate part of the general discussion. But also have in mind the general discussion is also a format where we can also debate the thesis from those lectures in a more broader context and bring your own commentary to it. Okay, so for now, the floor to you. Questions to Jan? Or any comments? Maybe I mentioned the coffee too early, so.
Yeah. Okay, the material disincentive.
Yeah, well, maybe we stop here and continue in like 20 minutes after coffee.